What are the major writings of Josephus? And did Josephus have a sense that his writings would be historical in the sense that, I think it was Winston Churchill who wrote history, and he said, "I'm a historian because I'm going to write the history of the wars and the empire and all that stuff." What did he write, Josephus? And did he have that kind of sense what his writings might one day be?
Sure. So Josephus primarily wrote four different works. The earliest of them is called Jewish War, War of the Jews. I should say everything that Josephus writes is in Greek. He does complete War of the Jews, Jewish War, in the year 79 CE. He actually writes, though, that even before he completed Jewish War, he did write something in a Semitic language, either Aramaic or Hebrew, that he says was directed, obviously, at the Jews. He doesn't say exactly what was in it, but it seems to have been an account of the war, perhaps an abbreviated version of Jewish War. But everything that he writes is in Greek. He actually says that he had to work very hard at Greek, that he actually ends up employing a couple of Greek assistants who maybe helped him with his grammar, perhaps helped him bone up on his knowledge of Greek literature. He writes the Jewish War in the year 79 CE, and it's important to understand the anti-Jewish sentiment that was swirling around Rome at that time. What I said before is that Josephus is directing this message in Rome, to the emperors at that time. And the war against the Jews held great propaganda value for the Flavian dynasty. And that's really because the Flavian dynasty had no real credentials to rule as emperors. And they really fell back on their success in defeating the Jews over the course of a couple of years as the basis for their claim to the throne. And they capitalized on that victory in a number of ways. They build multiple arches. We're familiar with the Arch of Titus, but historians have discovered that there was another Arch of Titus located on the other end of Rome in the Circus Maximus. Very unusual for the Romans to have celebrated a victory with two arches. Interestingly, the Arch of Titus that survives was not actually built by Titus himself. It was built by his brother Domitian, so that 15 years after the defeat of the Jews, they're still celebrating that victory with the erection of an Arch of Titus. And the reason for that is because it had enduring propaganda value for the Flavian dynasty. They mint a coin series known as the Judaic Capta coins. Again, and that series lasts for a generation throughout all of the Flavian kings. And again, celebrating the defeat of the Jews. We know that the Colosseum in Rome was paid for out of funds taken from Jerusalem and on the backs of Jewish slaves. Again, something that an inscription found in the Colosseum has disclosed, so that the massive Colosseum built by Vespasian also was associated with this victory. There are other ways in which the Romans tried to capitalize on this victory, but the result of it was widespread hostility and anti-Jewish sentiment in Rome at that time. And Josephus's account of the war in the Jewish War, which is basically a 7-book work, the last 6 of which basically recount the events from the 1st century CE, to a certain extent are meant to respond to that anti-Jewish sentiment. And really what he's trying to argue is that the Jewish War should be understood as a product of a small group of rabble-rousers who managed to whip into a frenzy the rest of Jewish society that, as I said before, by being faithful to their Jewish tradition, really were faithful to Rome, to Roman values, but swept into a frenzy by the small group of rabble-rousers to rebel against Rome. That's kind of the story that he tells about the war in the course of this 7-book work known as Jewish War, and it needs to be understood within the context of this anti-Jewish sentiment swirling around Rome. The first book of Jewish War really is the background to the actual rebellion, and it runs from the rise of the Hashmonaim, of the Hasmoneans, in the 160s BCE until the death of Herod in 4 BCE. So that's Jewish War in the year 79. His next work is called Antiquities of the Jews. Josephus says that initially his plan was to write one massive, very ambitious work that would have run from the beginning of creation until the fall of Masada in the year 73 CE. He says he realized that it was too ambitious, and so he began with Jewish war, and he turned back to writing this more ambitious work, Antiquities of the Jews, in the year 93 or 94. So about 15 years pass until he actually writes again. This is a 20-book work that is much more ambitious because he rewrites Tanakh, rewrites the Hebrew Bible from the beginning of the Torah up until the end of Tanakh in the first 11 books of Antiquities. Basically, from the end of book 11 until book 20, he talks about post-biblical history, and the end of Antiquities goes up until the eve of the revolt. I should say that the Jewish war ends, right, the work that I alluded to earlier, Jewish war ends with the defeat of the Jews at Masada in the year 73. Antiquities ends at the eve of the revolt, and his focus here is different, right? What he's trying to do is not just focus on the war. He doesn't even recount the events of the war. Really tells a story of Jewish history running from creation until the eve of the revolt with a slightly different purpose. In the preface to Antiquities of the Jews, what he says is, this is going to be a work that talks about divine intervention in history, talks about divine reward for those who are loyal to God, talks about divine punishment of those who are disloyal. And the story he says that he's going to tell about the Jewish tradition is that the Jews are faithful to a set of laws that correspond to the virtues, that the Romans hold dear, and that the reason that the Jews are able to both promulgate these laws and then remain loyal to them is because of the unique form of political ordering that the Jews enjoy. That unique form of political ordering, he says, is not monarchy, is not democracy, but rather is aristocracy, specifically a priestly aristocracy, a priestly aristocracy that enabled the Jews to remain faithful to this set of laws that corresponds to virtue and that won them the favor of God. And therefore, as with Jewish war, Antiquities really needs to be understood as a work of propaganda in which Josephus is speaking to the Rome of his day and trying to say, don't blame the Jews for the revolt. In fact, the Jewish tradition, correctly understood, corresponds very well to the values that you Romans celebrate. And so therefore, we need to understand the rebellion as an aberration rather than the norm. We know from other historians of the day, Tacitus maybe being a very good example. Tacitus, basically a younger contemporary of Josephus, Tacitus describes the rebellion basically as a reflection of the character of the Jews. And what Josephus is arguing both in War and in Antiquities is that that's not the correct way to understand the war against the Jews, war of the Jews against the Romans. So Antiquities is sort of his second major work. There's really an epilogue to Antiquities, which is his third work, known as the Life of Josephus. Life of Josephus, he says, he wrote as an epilogue, so presumably wrote it shortly after the completion of Antiquities, let's call it 94, 95, something like that. And it's not an autobiography so much as it is an account of Josephus's tenure as commander and governor in the Galilee. Much of what I said before is drawn from the account that Josephus tells in Life of Josephus. And it needs to be understood, the fact that it's really presented as an epilogue to Antiquities, it needs to be understood in light of the message that I outlined before. What Josephus is basically saying is, everything that I told you in Antiquities about Jews' loyalty to the laws as provoking divine favor, and that the Jews are able to remain loyal because of this priestly aristocracy that they have in place. Josephus is basically saying, I am the last link in that chain that proves that we are rewarded by God when we remain faithful, and that prove the success of a priestly aristocracy. He says he himself is a Kohen, and the story that he tells about his tenure in the North is one that returns repeatedly to this theme of divine favor, of divine providence. And so in that way, Life of Josephus really is an epilogue that proves everything that Josephus is trying to say about the Jewish tradition in general. It's not just that Josephus has a real survival instinct. Josephus clearly has a very inflated view of himself. So that's the Life of Josephus. The final work of Josephus is known as Against Appian. Against Appian is his most explicitly apologetic work, in which he says he's responding to accusations leveled against the Jews and various forms of slander, he begins by saying that he's addressing the claim that the Jewish tradition is not ancient, that the Jewish tradition is really recent in vintage. And what he wants to do is to try to respond to that. Along the way, he also responds to other forms of slander. And what Josephus does most explicitly, but what I've tried to show is the fact that this is actually a theme that crosses all of his writings. What Josephus tries to do is to show actually that the Jewish tradition really reflects core Roman virtues like justice, like courage, like temperance, like piety, correctly understood, and therefore the slanders that are directed against the Jews by their opponents are incorrect. Against Appian is not explicitly dated. We assume probably around the year 100, something like that. As far as the question of how Josephus regarded himself, in the beginning of War and Antiquities, there's no question that he describes himself as basically a successor to the great Greek historian Thucydides. He says that he's going to write about the war that was, the war to end all wars. He clearly regarded himself as having written a work of enduring value on par with that of Thucydides. What he's doing, he says, is he's arguing to an audience that is reading other competing accounts of the war. So part of what he wants to do is to correct the record, but that he had an inflated sense of himself as a historian seems to be clear from what he has to say in the beginning of both War and Antiquities.